I'm a first-year research student at Queen's University in between the Sonic Arts Research Center there and SPACE, which is the Architecture and Urban Planning Institute. My current PhD is titled Listening Practices for Urban Sound Space. And it's part of the Recomposing the City research group, which is headed by Gassi Ozonian and Sarah Lappin, my supervisors, and also bridges the fields of sound art and architecture/urban planning. And so I'm interested in what we learn about urban spaces through auditory or sonic thinking, kind of what we've been seeing here, actually, in your presentations. And also how listening practices drawn from approaches in sound arts might influence urban design practice and shape future concepts for a different, especially differently sounding city. And in my presentation, I'll just be focusing on two urban sound artworks to begin sort of to look at this reciprocity of sound practices and urban planning. So of course, sound is still an undervalued aspect of city environment. And auditory quality should be consciously dealt with in urban development and not left as a byproduct of design decisions that are prompted by visual concerns or economic. But rather than linking sound with noise pollution or something that needs to be fixed through abatement, I think it's important to explore impulses from fields that engage with sound in aesthetic, qualitative, personal ways. And of course, one of these is the field of sound art, which engages in active listening and a sounding out of constructed and conceptual city spaces. And in one way, it's easy to point to influences of architecture and spatial concepts in sound arts. And it's not surprising, considering the range of sound arts and the backgrounds of sound artists who also come from architecture, visual arts, etc. But it's interesting to start seeing influence run the other way as well. Sound artworks shaping conceptions of the urban and even its potential material construction. Where are we? Okay. So sound artworks, they invite us to listen to cities in new ways. They help us reconsider facets of urban life through a hearing perspective, revealing layers of this living space, this urban living space, that are generally overlooked. And I especially would like to consider how they guide our auditory experience, how certain works guide us through sonic and extrasonic materials to create these individual reconfigurations of city. And so I'm focusing on sound artworks, which not only take city as their sonic and subject matter, but which are sited, so are composed for a particular urban space. And obviously, it was what was already mentioned today, sound art is just all over the place. And of course, the situations in the pieces that I'm discussing are not just about sound, but how we perceive, navigate, interact with, and use the material sites in which the works are based, and which touch on social and conceptual layers of the city. And the first artists I'd like to mention are O&A, Bruce Odland, and Sam Owinger. And in many of their works, as I said, the urban sound environment is not only integrated into, but serves as the intended sound of the work, which is itself situated, again, in a city environment. And this includes, for example, their resonance works. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. Okay. Resonance works, like a recent one was Grundklang Bonn. And in these resonance works, the artists record ambient city sound through large tubes, through microphones positioned in large tubes like this. And the tubes are out of sight, but what happens is that the tubes act as resonators, they're tuning tubes, and they harmonically filter the sound through their acoustic properties. And this tuned sound is then sent as a live feed to a speaker that's positioned in public space. And in a lot of their works, this speaker is in the form of a cube or something that people can just sit on or walk around, and so people can hear and experience the tuned sound of the city coming out of the cube and the live, I would say the untuned live sound that's being filtered. So it's an interesting comparison of these tuned and untuned ambiances or atmospheres. And this tube happens to belong to a different work of theirs called Urban Sound, Urban Space. Urban Space, Urban Sound, sorry, which uses it in this tuning process in a slightly different way. Urban Space, Urban Sound, I was right. And this was a one-day installation and performance that was curated by Carsten Seifert and was part of the Achtbrücken Festival in Cologne. And the piece was installed inside a newly built underground train tunnel, which was still incomplete at the time. And sections of the piece happened at the platforms. So it's two platforms. This is an artist sketch, sorry, by Bruce. And the piece happened. You see on number 1 is the first station that visitors would come down into. The two parallel lines are 2 large tunnels. And number 3 here is the second station. So you'd walk from 1 to 2 and back around in a circuit. And it took about 40 minutes because it's train dimensions. So this first atrium and the tunnels and the station area were all played using different recordings, field recordings, lending the spaces various sonic characters. For example, the first atrium, number 1, was just completely filled with this thick, deep water harp tones. Meanwhile, the 2 tunnels, resounded with filtered street ambience from above. That's how this tuning tube process was used. And in this piece, instead of the live feed going to a cube, it actually goes into these large-scale concrete tunnels. And so it's going into a spatial architecture that conceptually parallels these tubes. And the far station, number 3, was played with a number of recordings, including one that was of Grand Central Station in New York, a station that I happen to know well myself. And this created a very ghostly effect of a living, active train station that was sonically embedded in a non-functional one. And for me personally, as a listener, it was sort of a trick of memory, since I knew the station well, could recognize it, but at the same time was in this very different architectural urban space. Just to give you a sense, this is the first atrium. This is very large. It's quite large scale. And you can see it's still all just very raw. There's nothing like a gallery, or there's nothing institutionalized about this. Or there's nothing sound art institutionalized about it. And finally, in the second tunnel, the artists performed using real-time manipulations of the recordings, including manipulating this, again, another live feed of the city sound, and really activating the space of the tunnel. And the sequence of these sonic atmospheres, as well as the process of descending the steps from the street down into the station, gave the piece a very strong sonic dramaturgy. So as a listener, you might get an impression of really inhabiting a sonic work by progressing physically through these various atmospheres. And the auditory character of those spaces was emphasized by the transitions from these different structural architectures from one to another, like going from this high-ceilinged atrium into a much more constricted and extremely long space of the tunnel. And also this spatialized music composed for this unfinished subway tunnel is a distinct example of creative practice temporarily adapting an urban architecture, a space designed for and conventionally defined through its infrastructural use into a place for potential aesthetic experience. Sorry. And it creates this through sound, through playing sound, but also through using the structures of the space itself, the memory of its listeners, like my memory of the live station, and memories for other listeners of the heard, but unseen traffic noises from above the tunnel. So for example, this tunnel would be playing the sounds that were recorded from the tube that I showed before. So as you're going from street level down into it, you have this. Yeah. this comparison. And this way, the piece granted access metaphorically and actually to a completely new version of the city. And I mean, city doesn't mean the same thing everywhere, of course, and nor does urbanity encompass the same experiences for everyone. And we're continually dealing with personal and partial ideas of a city, or what urban is or means, and we're also dealing with material places that are continually undergoing transformation. And these different concepts of city and urban that are used and activated in sound artworks change both the way that their production and their reception is approached. And reception especially is influenced by all the other meanings and uses that a space may have other than the current adoption as a place of art. And in some case, a work may lead you to, or lead us to explore a city or urban area you've never been before, or couldn't have been before, but it can also reframe a very familiar one. And in my case, this happened more recently with a work by Katrinem. Katrinem, another Berlin-based artist. In her work, Schutzugehör. And this is actually a good example of something you were talking about before, about participatory art. And as a listener in urban sound art, you are encouraged or even compelled to be a performer. And sometimes an irritation or a sculptural visual object is enough to elicit a listening behavior that's intended by the artist. But often more instruction is provided, a map with a path to follow, or a score, so the listener can more precisely navigate the scope of the work and more fully participate in it. And scores, of course, take many forms. There's notational, verbal, and graphic. And this example is the score by Katrinem. That's part of her Schutzugehör piece. This one is for a work in Manhattan, a version in Manhattan, in 2015. And this piece, Schutzugehör, path of awareness, I'll use the English word, path of awareness, belongs to a body of her work that's concerned with gaits and walking rhythms in urban space. And so for these pieces, Katrinem plots a path of awareness within an urban area. And she's done this for many cities already in all over the world. No problem. And she develops the route through research done on site, where she explores the area, of course, by walking on foot, but also observes traffic and pedestrian patterns. And once she's composed the specific route, the work takes 3 forms. She performs the route in a number of guided group walks and activates the spaces acoustically by her own practiced and very soundful footsteps. So really giving an impulse as she goes along. Secondly, she creates audiovisual documentations of the route that pair, so she uses binaural recordings and still intermittent images. I'll put up a link later where you can see it. And third, she creates a map or a graphic score of the route so that it can be walked individually by future listeners. And the routes are designed to go through a variety of sonic spaces. And the walk for Manhattan was really remarkable because it utilized a large number of public access walkways, as well as going down and through a subway station. And this use of interior and exterior public space created, again, a strong impression of contrasting ambiances and really underlined how built space shapes the thresholds between them. Okay, only 4 minutes. I'll talk faster. How built space, okay, there are thresholds between them. So, for example, going from high ceilinged, like these marble atriums into, here I am with the score, into large city streets. I mean, this is not only a sonic shift, but creates a sensibility for differences of lights, temperature, smell, materials, floor coverings, and the path threaded through diverse social spaces. As you can see, both in terms of different streets as well as in terms of the various public access areas themselves. And this really strengthened a sense of the city as rhythmed through movement, which was both in terms of the immediate experience, that articulated atmospheres set to a tempo of my footsteps, but also the impression came partly through the score, which highlighted things like direction of moving traffic. So each time here you cross certain streets, she also has the direction of moving traffic. And so this is something that really guided my attention really guided me to pay attention to that. So Katrinem's work is, of course, interactive. It encourages people to make sound through their footsteps, activating and playing their immediate environment as a sonic agent. And works like these are processes of their practices involved in planning, structuring, and guiding the potential listening experience, and in turn processes of listening and performing what's afforded by the artist. In pieces like Katrinem's, which are multiples based in city spaces, so specific to urban environments, but a series that can be redone for other locations. These repeating sets of processes in different urban spaces means that the works become really defined by the way they're embedded in the particular site and how they interact with it, or not. And always, rather than a detached ear, the expectation in the works is of a listener with many sensory and conceptual capacities. The ability to move around a space. Mobility is very important. All of which shape and are shaped by audition. And as you can see, these works create listening situations using various extrasonic components, visual cues, texts, to condition how the potential listener is invited or guided to experience the piece. I'll skip ahead. So works encourage listeners to, for example, recontextualize sound events and acoustic conditions of the urban environment, as well as sonic effects produced through the built environment, give listeners reasons to linger at a particular spot. They encourage and reward to pay attention to different layers of the urban ambiance or eavesdrop into otherwise inaccessible layers of its perceptual and social space. And they can encourage and reward a closer oral attention to urban environments as potential sources of interesting experiences rather than something to escape through headphones or abatement. So different kinds of sonic thinking. So we all know lots of different ways that sound art guides listening, so I'll skip some of those. But it's probably easy to see how these kinds of works can lead to ways of approaching the auditory environment approaching the auditory environment in a way that tries to grasp qualities and intentions rather than framing sound simply as an emission or in terms of volume or hi-fi or lo-fi. And if a city isn't delimited by its static built environment, but emerges through use, then engaging in the city in novel ways creates different versions of the city. And for this listener, the pieces above suggested a number of possible other urban characters, whether urban space, urban sound, orally transformed. O&A's piece transformed a built infrastructure into a temporary, almost mythical, other-sounding reality, or whether in Katrinem's work, these works accent my own agency in moving through city space and articulate the city as networks of movement. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead because of the time. I guess the point is that if sound art works and practices can reconfigure a concept of the urban, they can impact urban planning by influencing spatial practitioners as well, who are responsible for constructing urban environments, changing how they think about city and how they approach urban design. And there are already examples of sound artists explicitly participating in this exchange. Because really sound art practices probe the experience and materiality of urban spaces with particular regard to the auditory. And so the listening practices inherent in these sound artworks can inform ways of investigating urban sound space. And building on these processes in ways like these sound walks can support a design practice that considers urban sonic spaces, in which case the practices would become means of parsing elements of sound space, gleaning information from sound space, communicating about one's experience of sound space, designing with sound space in mind, and communicating design ideas to other urban and architectural practitioners. So the processes is used in the works like walking, tuning, mapping, scoring, guiding, relocating, or recontextualizing listening, implemented and combined in urban places, can lead to a reimagining or resounding of city. Sorry. Yes, so sorry, I was rushing that last part. These are.
Yes, no, I mean, I was rushing you, but we still have 5 minutes or 6 minutes or something like that, and we have a break. So, I mean, any questions are welcome, and if you feel like
especially if
you missed out something really important, you can.
No, it would better just ask if things were, if anything,
sure,
seemed not understandable.
Right.
Oh, sorry.
Sure.
But I've been working with city planners for several years, and trying to break through. It's quite hard, but there's a whole kind of professional field opening up in that world of city planning called placemaking and placemakers. And they, for example, like in London, your Battersea Power Station, huge, massive area, and so there's lots of different teams of architects who are involved in different things. But then there's a team of placemakers that will then come in and turn into a place. And it seems there that within this, I mean, they're kind of making it up, I think, you know. But there's a little window there within this thing called placemaking that I think you can kind of input interesting sonic interventions and sound design and soundscapes and so on. Is evolving. It seems there's more opportunity now than there has been.
Yes, I hope so. I think I would love to also direct attention to, for example, here, Sarah Lappin and Gassia Zonian, they've been talking more about, for example, acoustic urbanism and different directions and the overlap of these fields. And I think that something like placemaking or things that social aspects of spaces, like that's somewhere that sound is sort of somehow really clear that it's very important, but it's still very difficult to really, parse out why and how you would sort of plan for that. So,
I had a very frustrating experience. I was involved in this Academy of Urbanism's Place of the Year Award, and City of the Year Award, and I was involved in doing a sound installation of various selected places of the year in this kind of adjacent room. And in this upper room you had most of the top world city planners in this room drinking wine. And they were all talking about the sound installation in this room on the side that I was doing. But very few, like two of them came in. But they love, anecdotally, they really think the idea is great, but they're not really willing to just pop in and have a listen to actually what we've been exploring. But anyway, it's a they know the term soundscape, for example. It's very common parlance.
Yeah, I think that really does hit on a good, on one, I guess, difficult aspect which is like how do you make these sorts of things accessible? We're sort of initiated in this world of listening and participating and attentive listening and all different kinds of modes of listening, but how do you frame that in a way that makes it seem fruitful or constructive for urban planners and for their field? So I don't have answers yet. Ideas, just
What they need is case studies. That's what.
I guess
I'm not sure if that was a question, but
will you be researching what works for urban planners? Will you take that step as well and kind of evaluate the effectiveness of different kinds of sound art for different kinds of planners or architects?
Yeah, I don't want to say anything too specific because there are different methods now under consideration, but I do think that while on the one hand you can sort of draw different sort of potential listening practices or components of listening practices from sound art and sound art practices, things like phonography and sound walking and mapping and sonification and translocation and all of these sort of methods or partial methods or strategies, but in a way they're not so interesting on their own, or they're not informative on their own, and they really need to be put back into specific sites, and they need to be put into sort of specific, localized and situated research. So that is what, or as you just mentioned, case studies, to see what you can really learn from different kinds of sound walking or phonography and combined strategies. Yeah.
Like to add that, as has been mentioned, the terms soundscape or sound walks and all that are now familiar to architects and urban planners, and but it's a matter of educating them into including the voice of the people for which they design the spaces. So this is where the artists come, and they bring this bottom-up approach, this more so the placemaking also echoes the meaning of the place for the people that will inhabit or move through it. It's not a question, it's just a comment. This is what it's of interest to me, at least.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I mean, it's sort of the personal aspect. This is, that is something that, I mean, for me, this is looking at sound art. I sort of mentioned it's, for me, very much trying to find an alternative to something like noise research or approaches, I guess, sort of institutional approaches, the way that sound is dealt with as an emission or in decibels, which is very impersonal, of course. It's trying to be impersonal because it needs to deal with an entire city, but at the same time, that's, there needs to be also this approach to complement that and to bring it life. So I don't know if there are any other. I mean, when I think, for example, when I think about personal or sound artists that deal with sort of personal experiences of urban spaces, something I didn't talk about, but I've talked about before is Peter Cusack and his Favorite Sounds project, and in this part of this involves he goes around and he asks people about their favorite sound of a city, and in a way it sounds so simple, but it just comes up with really amazing answers because it's like you're hearing the city through the way that people describe it, and they don't necessarily choose sounds based on their on things you would think that people would choose sounds as. Sometimes it's a very abstract or philosophical idea, and so I see this as also a kind of research. What he does, it's very, and I think it's important to look at cities in that way as well.
Yes, and you have, if you talk to different people, you have so many. You would be surprised because it's based on ethnicity, gender, and everything. So this is the Cusack's project is really great. Yeah.
So I have
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.